There is a story most people in England grew up believing without ever questioning it. It was taught in classrooms, illustrated in textbooks, repeated in museum displays, and embedded quietly in the national sense of self. The story went something like this. The English are descended primarily from Anglo-Saxons, Germanic warriors who crossed the North Sea after the collapse of the Roman Empire, settled the island, and gave England its language, its laws, and its cultural foundation. Before those Anglo-Saxons came the Celts, fierce and ancient, whose descendants still survive in Wales and Scotland. And before the Celts came various Neolithic and Bronze Age peoples who raised stone monuments and then blended gradually into the populations that followed them. It was a layered story, but a continuous one. A story of accumulation rather than replacement. A story where each incoming group added to what was already there without fundamentally erasing it. For centuries, nobody had the tools to challenge this version of events in any decisive way. Historians worked from chronicles written by monks and scribes. Archaeologists worked from burial goods and pottery sherds. Linguists traced the evolution of sounds and grammar through dead languages. Each discipline built its own picture of the past, and while those pictures sometimes disagreed on details, they converged on the same general story. The English were fundamentally the descendants of ancient inhabitants who had occupied the island through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Roman period, and into the medieval world. The origins were complicated, perhaps, but they were traceable. And they were deep. Then, scientists began extracting DNA from ancient teeth and bones. At first, just a handful of samples. Then dozens. Then hundreds. From burial sites scattered across the length and breadth of England, Wales, and Scotland. From graves that had been sealed for thousands of years. From skeletal remains sitting in museum storage rooms that had not been seriously examined since they were first excavated in the 19th century. And as the ancient genomes accumulated and the analytical tools grew sharper and more sophisticated, the story that emerged from the data bore almost no resemblance to the story that had been told for generations. Not in its details. In its structure. Because the DNA did not show a continuous, accumulating population flowing forward through time. It showed something far more dramatic, far more disruptive, and far more honest. To understand why the ancient DNA findings were so shocking, you need to first understand what was at stake in the old narrative, and why it had been held so confidently for so long. The conventional view of English origins was not built on ignorance. It was built on the best available evidence interpreted through the most reasonable available framework. And for most of the 20th century, it held together quite well. The foundational assumption about the Anglo-Saxon migration was that it was real but demographically contained. After the Romans left Britain in the early 5th century, the political and economic infrastructure of the island began to deteriorate rapidly. Towns contracted. Trade collapsed. The sophisticated urban life of Roman Britain retreated, and in its place, new power structures began to emerge. Germanic peoples from the continental coastlines, the Angles from the region of modern Schleswig-Holstein, the Saxons from further south, the Jutes from Denmark, began to arrive on British shores. They arrived as raiders first, then as settlers, then as rulers. They imposed their language, which we now call Old English, on large parts of what became England. They reorganized the land into new kingdoms. They reshaped the material culture of the island. But the mainstream scholarly view held that these newcomers were not numerous enough to have fundamentally replaced the existing population. The Romano-British people, it was argued, mostly stayed where they were. They adopted the language and customs of their new rulers over time, as subordinate populations often do. But they continued to work the same fields, live in the same villages, and pass their genes to the same next generations. The Anglo-Saxons were the architects of a new cultural England, but the biological substance of the population remained largely as it had been, descended from the Iron Age Celtic and pre-Celtic inhabitants who had occupied the island for thousands of years before. The second major assumption about Neolithic continuity rested on similarly solid-seeming archaeological evidence. The great megalithic building projects of Neolithic Britain, Stonehenge, Avebury, the West Kennet Long Barrow, dozens of other monuments across the landscape represented an enormous investment of organized labor and social coordination. The people who built them were sophisticated. They were not pushed aside easily. And the prevailing interpretation was that when new cultures arrived in Britain during the Bronze Age, they mixed with and absorbed the existing Neolithic communities rather than replacing them wholesale. The monuments remained. Presumably, so did the people who built them. It seemed logical. It seemed human. It was almost entirely wrong. The science that made it possible to answer these questions definitively did not arrive suddenly. It was built piece by piece across several decades of work in molecular biology, chemistry, and computational analysis before converging into a revolution that transformed what was knowable about the deep human past. For most of the history of archaeology, the idea of reading the genetics of ancient populations was theoretical at best. DNA, the molecule that carries the biological instructions for building and operating a living organism, is also extraordinarily fragile. From the moment an organism dies, DNA begins to degrade. Enzymes break the strands apart. Water molecules hydrolyze the chemical bonds. Bacteria invade and contaminate. Heat accelerates every destructive process. In most burial conditions, after just a few thousand years, the DNA in ancient remains is fragmented into millions of short, overlapping pieces, many of them chemically altered in ways that make them difficult to distinguish from contamination introduced by the researchers themselves. The breakthrough came in stages. First, improvements in laboratory protocols allowed scientists to extract ancient DNA under ultra-sterile conditions that prevented modern contamination from overwhelming the ancient signal. Then, the development of next-generation sequencing platforms made it possible to read millions of short DNA fragments simultaneously, rather than having to sequence one long intact strand at a time. Finally, sophisticated computational algorithms were developed to assemble those millions of fragments back into a coherent genome, filtering out contamination, repairing chemical damage, and filling in gaps using statistical inference. By the mid-2010s, these tools had matured to the point where ancient DNA research became not just possible, but productive at scale. Researchers at institutions including Harvard Medical School, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany, and the Francis Crick Institute in London began sequencing ancient genomes from sites across Europe and beyond in large numbers. The British Isles, with their extensive archaeological record and their rich collections of skeletal material held in university and museum archives, became one of the most intensively studied regions in the world. Sample by sample, the genetic history of Britain was reconstructed. And what it showed, when the full dataset was assembled and analyzed, was a history of repeated, large-scale, and often near-total population replacement that no previous form of evidence had been able to detect. The first major finding was not from the period most people would have expected. It did not come from the Anglo-Saxon migrations, or from the Roman occupation, or even from the Celtic expansions of the Iron Age. It came from a moment so deep in prehistory that it predates all recorded history by thousands of years. And it revealed a rupture in the British population record so complete that researchers struggled to find the right language to describe it. The Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge and populated Britain from roughly 4000 BC onward carried a distinct genetic ancestry that linked them to the original farming populations of the Near East, who had spread agriculture into Europe over several millennia. They were not related in any close way to the hunter-gatherers who had lived in Britain before them. They were themselves migrants who had replaced an earlier population. But they had been in Britain long enough, by 2500 BC, to have become what most people would call the established inhabitants. They built the monuments. They cultivated the fields. They were the people of the land. Then, the Bell Beaker people arrived. Named for their distinctive pottery, these communities spread rapidly across Western Europe from around 2500 BC onward, carrying with them a genetic ancestry that derived primarily from populations of the Pontic-Caspian steppe in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. When researchers compared the genomes of people buried in Britain just before the Bell Beaker horizon with the genomes of people buried just after it, the difference was stark and almost total. The Neolithic genetic signature, the ancestry of the people who built the monuments, dropped from nearly 100% of the population to roughly 10% within just a few generations. The Bell Beaker migrants did not add themselves to the existing population. They replaced it. 90% or more of the Neolithic gene pool was swept away and replaced by incoming steppe-derived ancestry in what remains one of the most complete demographic replacements ever documented in European prehistory. Then came the Anglo-Saxon finding, and it was equally devastating to the traditional narrative. When researchers analyzed ancient genomes from burial sites in eastern England dating to the 5th and 6th centuries AD, they found that the genetic profile of the population had shifted dramatically and with remarkable speed. Individuals buried in these communities carried ancestry that was overwhelmingly derived from continental northern Europe, from modern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. In some communities, the proportion of incoming ancestry was so high that traces of the earlier Romano-British population could barely be detected. The Anglo-Saxon migration was not the arrival of a thin cultural elite. It was a large-scale population movement that replaced substantial portions of the existing British gene pool within a span of perhaps 3 or 4 generations. The people who eventually became the English were, to a very significant degree, the descendants of those continental migrants, not the Celtic Iron Age inhabitants who had lived in Britain before them. The implications of these findings spread outward from the data in multiple directions simultaneously, and each direction led to a different kind of reckoning with assumptions that had been held with great confidence for a very long time. The immediate historical implication was stark and unavoidable. The formation of England was not, at its biological core, a cultural transformation of a stable indigenous population. It was a demographic event. A population that had been in place for several centuries, descended from Iron Age Celts and Romano-British communities, was replaced to a very large degree by incoming migrants from the continental North Sea coast. Whatever the specific mechanisms of that replacement, whether through violence, disease, economic marginalization, or simply the reproductive dominance of the larger incoming population, the genetic record showed the outcome with unambiguous clarity. The English, in their dominant biological ancestry, are not the descendants of ancient Britons who adopted Germanic culture. They are largely the descendants of Germanic migrants who made Britain their home. The broader historiographical implication was equally significant. Scholars had debated the nature of the Anglo-Saxon migrations for more than a century, drawing on place names, linguistic evidence, documentary sources, and archaeological material culture. All of those debates, however sophisticated, had been conducted without access to the most direct evidence available, the genetics of the people themselves. Ancient DNA did not simply add one more data point to an existing debate. It resolved the debate in a way that the other evidence types never could, by speaking directly about the biological substance of the population rather than the cultural products they left behind. The identity implication was perhaps the most personally resonant for many people. National identity in England, as in most countries, rests in part on a sense of deep connection to a particular land and a particular ancestral past. The idea of being English has often been tied, consciously or unconsciously, to an imagined continuity with the ancient inhabitants of the island. The ancient Na findings do not destroy that connection. But they do fundamentally alter its nature. The roots go back, yes, but they do not go back in Britain as far as most people assumed. They go back, in very large part, to the continental European coastline from which the Anglo-Saxon migrants departed more than 1,500 years ago. That is not a lesser origin. But it is a different one. Step back from England now, and step back from the specific timeline of British prehistory, because the pattern that the ancient DNA reveals in Britain is not unique to Britain. It is a global pattern, a human pattern, and understanding it changes not just how we think about English origins, but how we think about the origins of any people anywhere on Earth. Every national and ethnic identity on Earth carries within it some version of the myth of deep continuity, the idea that the people of a place are the descendants of the ancient people of that same place, and that this biological connection gives a special and irreducible meaning to belonging. The ancient DNA record has now been applied, with varying degrees of completeness, to populations across Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Africa. And wherever the data is dense enough to draw firm conclusions, the same unsettling truth emerges. Population replacements that were large, rapid, and sometimes near complete are a recurring feature of human prehistory, not an exception to it. In continental Europe, the Neolithic farming populations that spread from the Near East were themselves replaced across a wide swath of the continent by incoming Bronze Age populations carrying steppe ancestry. The people who built the Great Passage tombs of Ireland, the megalithic temples of Malta, the long barrow complexes of Scandinavia, their genetic legacy was dramatically reduced or eliminated by subsequent migrations that the archaeological record had not fully anticipated. In the Americas, the populations encountered by European explorers in the 15th century were themselves the descendants of multiple migration waves, some of which had transformed the genetic composition of entire regions within relatively brief periods. In South Asia, ancient DNA from the subcontinent has revealed population movements of enormous scale that reshaped the genetic landscape thousands of years before the oldest historical records of the region. The comfortable idea that any living population is the direct, unbroken biological continuation of the ancient people of their land is, in almost every case that has been seriously examined, a simplification at best and a myth at worst. Human beings have always moved. They have always entered landscapes already occupied by others. And the outcomes of those encounters, whether peaceful, violent, or somewhere in between, have repeatedly produced demographic transformations that erased previous populations from the genetic record with a thoroughness that the cultures themselves never preserved any memory of. The past was not stable. It was turbulent, mobile, and constantly reshaping itself in ways that the living could not know and the dead could not tell, until now. Here is the question that all of this ultimately presses us toward. If the story of your origins is not what you believed, if the deep ancestral roots you imagined extending backward through the centuries turn out to be shorter, more complicated, and more interrupted than the story required, what does that mean for the identity built on top of that story? What remains when the foundation is revised? The answer, examined carefully, is more reassuring than it might initially appear, and it is also more challenging than the reassurance suggests. What remains is everything that was made. The English language, arguably the most consequential linguistic development in recorded human history, now spoken as a first or second language by more than 1.5 billion people, was built by the descendants of those Anglo-Saxon migrants who arrived on the island 1,500 years ago. The legal traditions that shaped parliamentary democracy, the literary inheritance that runs from the earliest surviving Old English poetry through Shakespeare and Dickens to the writers working today, the philosophical and scientific traditions that drove the Industrial Revolution and shaped the modern world. None of this is diminished by the knowledge that the people who built it were themselves the products of a relatively recent mass migration rather than an unbroken ancient lineage. A civilization is not made less real by the circumstances of its demographic origins. It is made by what its people chose to build. But there is something genuinely important and worth sitting with in the discomfort this knowledge produces. The impulse to claim deep ancestral roots in a particular place, the impulse the old narrative was built to satisfy, has historically been used to draw lines between those who belong and those who do not. When ancient DNA shows that every population considered ancient was itself once a recent arrival, and that the people who feel most rooted are often the descendants of migrants who displaced someone else, it quietly undermines every identity claim built on biological continuity with the deep past. The bones of ancient Britain did not set out to make a point. They simply preserved, in the dense mineral structure of teeth and cortical bone, a molecular record of who was actually here and where those people actually came from. For millennia, that record was inaccessible. The stories people told about themselves filled the silence, and those stories served the needs of the living rather than the truth of the dead. Now the silence is broken. The ancient genomes speak with a precision that no written source, no artifact, no monument can match. They say the people of England have been replaced before, catastrophically, repeatedly, within spans of time that felt brief even by archaeological standards. They say the ancestors most English people imagine when they think of their deepest roots were not the original inhabitants of the island, and they say that the story of who any of us are is not a simple line drawn from the present back into the ancient past. It is a web of migrations, collisions, replacements, and reinventions, each layer sitting on top of the one before it, each generation inheriting a world shaped by movements it knew nothing about. This is not a diminishment of the English story. It is an expansion of it into something truer and more worthy of the people living it. Because a history honest about its own complexity, one that acknowledges migration and transformation as fundamental to how every people came to exist, is a history that belongs to all of humanity. The dead have spoken. For the first time in human history, we are truly listening.